Are we inevitably, as of late summer 2019, heading to a no-deal Brexit?
It certainly looks that way. I was very interested back at the time on March 31st when Theresa May's government applied for the extension to get more time for Brexit. Remember at the time a lot of people were sort of hopeful that that would mean that things would change and that Brexit would not actually happen at all, that the opportunity would be used to try and actually come to their senses in Britain in relation to it. And in fact, what's been really interesting to see how it's actually gone to the other extreme, how the hardliners have effectively taken control of the process in the UK and how they've, this sort of almost scorched earth approach that they want to actually take to it. There's so much stuff that's going on at the moment, it's very hard to keep in track with everything that's going on. But I have been interested in the way that they have almost pretended, there's sort of been a bit of gaslighting going on, that they have been prevented from leaving the European Union. That's not the case at all. It's like the European Union saying, yeah, cheerio, good luck, don't let the door hit your arse on the way out.
Well, there's a huge PR battle now, isn't there, in the sense that they are, it feels like it's entirely constructed by the Johnson
yeah, there's a game
government
going on at the moment.
To lay the blame on the EU and to a lesser extent on Ireland as well.
But it's very transparent, and who's actually buying this? Who's actually agreeing with the approach that they're actually taking? In an awful lot of there is a certain amount of deja vu. A lot of the arguments that have been made, for sort of technology to deal with the issues of the border, even the sort of ideas coming out that when maybe Ireland should get some sort of special deal whereby it has regulatory alignment with the UK, which is leaving the EU, even though that would take us out of the single market. Almost this deliberately, I mean, the people who are suggesting this must know that Britain is far less important to Ireland as a trading destination than the rest of the EU, but still this belief that they're feeding to their own supporters that little Ireland needs Britain, and if we put the squeeze in little Ireland, that'll help us to get what we want.
Well, of course, what didn't Priti Patel make the infamous comments?
Want to starve us out?
Yeah. The potato famine, that we should be mindful of this and so on. I mean, on top of the fact that it was pretty shocking, it's also entirely wrong. My understanding of it is that Ireland, I think, imports 4.5 billion worth of food and drink.
But they need
Britain.
us. This is one of the interesting things, is that Britain actually does need Ireland as a destination because we're the 5th biggest market for Britain. Now, for all their talk that the Brexiteers have about all the new markets that'll be opened up to them, I'm fascinated seeing them boasting we can get a deal with Japan. Do you mean you're not actually exporting to Japan as it stands, as part of the EU? What better deal are you going to get from Japan or India or various other places to compensate for putting yourself at a disadvantage in trading with Europe and trading with Ireland? So yeah, they need us. I mean, if you even look back to where we actually had our economic crisis, the meltdown of 2010, and Britain made a €7 billion, or 7 billion sterling, it may have been loaned to Ireland at the time.
That's right.
That was motivated out of self-interest.
Yeah.
Because there was so much British investment in Ireland and trade with Ireland that they didn't do this out of some sort of great grandiose gesture that they felt sorry for us. That was a hard-headed commercial decision.
Yeah.
So when you think about it, yes, Irish exporters are going to have major problems in exporting into Britain if tariffs come into place. But by the same token, British exporters to Ireland, they need us. They need that business.
And in terms of the Irish government, are we ready for a no-deal Brexit? And I suppose, what does it actually ultimately mean for us? I mean, does anybody know the full answer to that question?
No, there's a lot of unknowns, or to use the old phrase, unknowns about what actually could happen. There's a certain amount of preparation that's been done, but you don't know what you're preparing for a lot of the times. Now, we're assured that there have been supply chains set up for medicines, things like that can come from continental Europe that don't have to come via the land bridge of Britain. We are in a particularly vulnerable position. The hardline Brexiteers are probably right here because we do use Britain as a land bridge to get to continental Europe for a lot of our exports, but also for importing things. The imports has been largely overlooked, and it even comes down to things like manufacturing. If we want things like nuts and bolts and screws, 25% of those actually come from Britain. So where do we get a replacement for those, particularly as they may be hoarding their own things that they need? There could be a shortage of biscuits, for example, from the 1st of November. You could find that Santa Claus is going to be unable to deliver many of the things that the Irish children actually want, because they simply won't be available because of tariffs and restrictions and quotas and things like that. There are going to be issues for us, there's no doubt. So then the question becomes as to whether the EU is going to actually step in with the required compensation funds, particularly to support those businesses which are going to be adversely impacted disproportionately to the rest of the economy.
Well, I mean, obviously, the food and drink industry, the dairy industry and so on, they're talking about that as being, obviously, particularly around the border counties, we'll talk about the border in a minute.
But cheddar cheese is a fantastic example of this, because this may seem like a small example, but we sell our cheddar into Britain because the British like cheddar cheese. You can't sell cheddar into France because the French have perhaps slightly more sophisticated tastes when it comes to cheese. Yeah. So if we don't sell it to Britain, we ain't selling it elsewhere.
But presumably Boris Johnson is going to look very, very foolish if it turns out that he kind of is bluffing, because all of this do or die, get out, take them on the beaches at Dunkirk kind of talk. If he doesn't deliver on it, presumably he knows that that's going to be hugely damaging to his own government.
Hang on, what has ever been damaging to Boris Johnson? Has he ever worried about his credibility? I mean, he's a credibility-free zone. Boris Johnson does not, he seems to have this extraordinary ability to get away with it, when that actually, if he never gets caught out in his outrageous lies, or it becomes part of this personality that people seem to go by. I know the Trump comparisons can be a bit facile, but actually there is quite a bit of a similarity in the way that when you have a narcissistic, egotistical individual, that they almost brush aside any of the difficulties or the way that they're perceived, because they just perceive themselves so well. And there is an awful lot of crossover in the tactics that were used, first of all, in the Brexit campaign in 2016, then in Trump's presidential election, and since in their dealing to in the way that they speak to those who are already committed, and how they completely manage to reinforce, and how they also manage to lie about things that are plainly obvious in front of you, but yet they manage to convince people are somewhat different. It's very interesting to watch propaganda in action.
No, but having said that, Boris Johnson does have to be re-elected. He is answerable to the people. You know, essentially, up to now, he's never really been answerable to anybody. Maybe, I don't know, the editor of various publications that he writes for, but he's never been answerable to the people. So presumably, if he doesn't deliver Brexit as he says he's going to, you know, how is he going to slip out of that one?
That's a good question, but maybe what he's really trying to do, maybe what he's trying to do at the moment is kill the Brexit party. Maybe he's just trying to kill Nigel Farage and trying to get the Tories back into a position of strength. Maybe this is just a big gamble, so whenever he can have a general election, be it before the 31st of October or afterwards, that they can get back into majority, shake the DUP loose, and then Johnson, being a man devoid of principles, is exactly the type of guy who will actually cut the very deal with the EU that he has said he would never do.
The Theresa May deal, basically reheat the Theresa May deal.
You wouldn't put it past him to actually, and then to say that he has been convinced of the requirements of the Good Friday Agreement, the need for peace in Ireland, blah, blah, blah. And remember, this is also a man who originally said that there was no question of Britain leaving the single market.
That's right. It was an argument from 2013 or
2015. It was that recently. And all of the people, the various leading lights of the Brexiteer movement in 2016 were saying there was no question of leaving the single market, the customs union. Margaret Thatcher was the one who actually forced the single market into being. She was one of the European leaders of the single market. And in some respects, there was a certain amount of benefit to what she was actually saying, and maybe she didn't like the political union, she didn't want the overweening powers for the council of ministers, whatever and stuff, and you can actually understand why. So if Britain wanted to get away from that, fair enough, but it does seem like an act of willful self-harm to then not want to be part of a customs union and a single market to give greater economic clout.
Well, can I ask you, what does Boris Johnson say to the leaders of big business? We saw up in Northern Ireland recently, and one of the leaders from around, I think, Strangford Lough was talking
What does he say? We can be great again. We can have a fantastic country. We're the best country in the world. He's just going to give propaganda. But the people who say we're going to lose, thousands of jobs and it's going to hugely impact on blight communities and so on. Don't be so negative. Don't be so negative. This is the problem that Boris Johnson has identified.
Oh, just don't be so negative.
Exactly. And it's all bombast.
Yeah.
You're talking detail. He doesn't do detail. He
but
does
presumably,
big,
though,
big
to people, Matt, who
feelings.
are hugely influential and hugely, massive business leaders and so on, presumably when you're in a room with them, you can't just bombast your way out of it.
Yes, you can. There are people who actually, do you think that he is that different when he actually is in a situation like that? But I'll tell you one thing, business people have an awful lot to answer for in Britain and in Northern Ireland for allowing this situation to develop.
Well, how did they allow it to develop?
Well, I'll give you an example. I was up in the north last year doing a speech for a business conference. And as I put it to them, businesses in Northern Ireland knew, from all the conversations I've been having with people, how bad Brexit would be for Northern Ireland. They were quiet in advance of the actual vote. Now, of course, Northern Ireland did vote against Brexit by a substantial majority, but they were quiet. They didn't actually give guidance and explain to people how their businesses might actually be damaged. Then when we got into the whole thing about negotiations as to how Britain would leave, they remained quiet. They left it to the politicians. They were afraid. Yet they all knew the consequences and said nothing. So how can they complain now when you end up in a situation with a no-deal Brexit where their businesses get completely shagged up when they said nothing in the early stages and left it to politicians who knew very little, who was engaged in propaganda, that they actually didn't confront them with their lies? It's too late to be crying afterwards.
So you're saying it's not just the DUP who are kind of forcing the issue. You're saying that.
But it's not a question of forcing the issue, but people backed off.
Yeah.
And when you back off and you don't confront things at the right time, you do become complicit.
The DUP isn't simply kind of enforcing its will over the people.
Well, it is enforcing its will in that it's a minority position that it is effectively forced. And it's a very ideological position. There's no practicalities about it. I mean, this is actually one of the interesting things about modern 21st century political life globally, is the amount of the way that people seem to default to ideological situations. So for all the talk about the politics, it's about the economy stupid, that people vote about what leaves them materially better off. Actually, that seems to be a surface thing, that when things change, they sort of revert to ideological beliefs.
Well, the economic effects on Britain, I mean, they talk about, Airbus at 14,000 jobs. They talk about plants in Vauxhall and other, car plants. They talk about oil refineries is the latest thing I read. I mean, what kind of impacts do you think it will have on Britain? Will they be disastrous?
I think London will continue to prosper because London is a major international city and is a financial hub. So London, which of course wanted to stay within the EU and will lose certain passporting rights, as they call it, for financial services, without getting too technical about it.
Will they lose?
But yeah, they will. But London will survive because there's an international trend, maybe a greater trend, in that everything is getting centralized into cities, and rural areas are becoming, are falling away compared to urban areas. So London will still remain this major international hub. It's the rest of England. Now maybe the other cities like Manchester or Leeds, places like that, which are relatively modern, will do okay. But it's all the other parts around, and that's where the real losses will come. And then you have the likes of the Sunderland voted to leave. Sunderland will suddenly, what happens to it if Nissan decides it's no longer producing cars there because of Brexit? You have places like Hull and Grimsby, which bizarrely, with their fishing industries, were then looking for sort of exemptions to remain within the EU single market, which is just actually unreal when you think about that these are the very people who voted for Brexit who now realise that they're the ones who suffer the most from it.
Well, people are assuming that it is going to incite such passions and political passions that this will turn itself into a rerun of the Troubles and so on, that this will emerge again. Do you think that'll happen?
Who knows? I mean, the one thing I think we should realise from recent years is predicting the future is real mug's game. However, you have to look at history and you have to look at trends of what have happened in history. They may not repeat themselves exactly, but certain things will actually end up. But if you think it's 50 years ago, August 1969, since the Troubles broke out in Northern Ireland, they broke out for entirely different reasons. They didn't break out because of some great nationalist desire to reunify the Ireland. They broke out because of institutionalized abuse of the minority peoples. It was a civil rights movement. So I mean, that's something that actually has to be remembered. And then the trigger for the upsurgence in the nationalist revival was effectively the arrival of the British soldiers in a partisan fashion. Because remember, when they were arrived in the first place, they were welcomed by the Catholic community as a saviour against the B specials and the various other parts of the unionist establishment who were suppressing Catholics at the time. But things changed very quickly. So I suppose that's a lesson from history that we have to remember, is that you make assumptions on what is likely to happen and why it'll happen, and then things take a twist and go in an entirely different direction. There's been an interesting cultural shift dramatically over the last 50 years on this island. And one of the reasons why unionists didn't want to be involved in a united Ireland is that they regarded us as almost backward socially and economically. Socially in relation to what they regarded as repressive Rome rule. Now the irony is that they feel, now that we've embraced things like abortion and same-sex marriage, they're horrified at that, and suddenly, they would almost like the old Rome rule, too progressive for them, right? So that's one thing, but economically it's also really interesting because, okay, sometimes it's exaggerated the extent to which the British state props up the Northern Irish economy, that there is not quite as many people working in public service jobs as is sometimes said. However, in private industry, the amount of exports that are done from Northern Ireland, the vast bulk goes to Britain. They've actually never seen beyond Britain for the development of Northern Ireland. Whereas in south of the border, where we have actually hoovered up all of the inward investment from the United States and elsewhere to get a foothold in the European Union, whereby Britain now only accounts for 12% of our exports, we have surpassed them economically dramatically over the last 50 years. And I think this is one of the things, I suppose, is almost a bitterness in relation to that, this realization that the hanging on to the part, being part of the empire, hasn't actually worked for them. But rather than confront that reality, they want to, like the hardline Brexiteers, cling to the past in the belief that returning to the past rather than embracing the present and the future will bring about prosperity. It's a really interesting psychological thing which seems to be going on.
Okay, can I ask you, do you see this whole Brexit issue, whatever happens, as a potential breakup of the Union of the UK?
I think clearly it has that potential, and that then raises the potential for us to have very serious conversations as to what we want for this island of Ireland after it. And I think that could lead to very, very difficult conversations, because we too could fall prey to having our discussions on an emotional basis rather than a rational and practical one as to what a new united Ireland would actually mean. And it's a question of who would actually provide the leadership in that, because does the leadership come from the centre or does it come from the extremes? You can look at, for example, the Good Friday Agreement was put together because you had to bring the extremes in Northern Irish politics into the middle ground, but they didn't really come into the middle ground. And maybe the reason now that things have broken down in the north and we have the potential for violence again is that it's not the likes of the SDLP and the Ulster Unionist Party who are actually the ones who are leading the way.
Well, they've completely disappeared from for a long time.
But is that maybe the reason why things have broken down in the north? That the centre didn't hold, and what we have now is the two extremes arguing with each other?
Is there any upside for the Irish economy in the event of a hard Brexit? Like, will we be, damned? Bearing in mind that we came through the bailout and all of that, we did actually come through it. Is there potential upside?
There is some potential upside for us in certain industries and service sectors based on capital flows, that if we remain part, and we will remain part of the single market and customs union, that outside investment will flow to Ireland to gain access to the EU, and that Britain is cutting itself off in that regard and we can benefit from it. Our problem is we have simple fundamental issues such as not actually having enough houses to live in, perhaps even not having enough commercial space available for those companies that may relocate to Ireland. There's benefit in that. There's going to be losses in certain sectors such as the food industry, part of the normal ebbs and flows, and perhaps at times we don't look at the overall as much as we should, such as the recent argument that we've had here in Ireland about supporting beef farmers, for example. Should we scupper the EU deal with Latin America, South America, the Mercosur deal, on the basis that it's not good for our beef farmers, ignoring the fact that overall the deal is massively to the benefit of Ireland for all of the other non-beef farmers in the Irish economy. Sometimes we don't look at necessarily at what the bigger picture is. So maybe short-term, medium-term damage will be done to us by a hard deal Brexit, but long-term, more damage will be done to Britain, and yes, maybe that's where we will get our benefit and opportunity from.
Okay, Matt, in the event of a hard Brexit, no deal, etc., will we, A, get help from Europe, our dairy industry, our farmers and so on, and various other sectors? And will that come at a price? Will it be a precursor to, say, a tax harmonisation discussion?
Let me start with the second part of that. I would hope and I would expect that on the basis of the fact that we're able to protect our nation's sovereign right to decide our own tax rates at the time of the bailout, that we will be able to do so now. Not just because we did it previously, but I think there's lots of other countries in the EU who would not want us to lose that because they don't want to lose it themselves. So I would be reasonably confident in relation to that. On the other point about as to what supports we will get, again, I would be reasonably confident that we'll get those supports for the simple reason that, and this seems to be overlooked by the British a lot of the time, the EU has to take a firm stand against Britain on the way out because it doesn't want to set a precedent where other countries might decide they want to get out of the European Union, leading to a breakup of the European Union by going out and getting the same advantageous terms outside the EU that the British are seeking to get.
Yeah, so the stakes are very, very high.
The stakes are very, very high in it. Now, you could say as well that Ireland has been let down in the past by the EU. I mean, there was remember back in 2014 where we thought we were actually going to get compensation for bailing out the banks at the behest of the European Central Bank, and none of that actually happened. We were still left with the debt burden of rescuing the banks back in the crash of a decade ago. So that is something that we always have to remember with a certain degree of, okay, these things can go against us. But at the moment, I think the most important thing is that for other reasons, not just Ireland, the EU has to be seen to be backing Ireland. There's also, I think there's an interesting, it's a rather simplistic analogy, but it is one I think that's quite useful. Imagine you're a member of a club or something, say, just for the sake of our tennis club or a golf club or something like that. Sorry for taking very middle class examples, but let's just use it from the point of view of where it would happen. Just imagine that you are a member of a club, golf club, based on certain rules, and you decide you want to leave because you don't want to pay the fees anymore. But you still want to be able to have access to play on the course at any time of your choosing. Well, if you're going to get that access to the golf course, you are going to have to meet certain other rules, even as some sort of auxiliary or associate member. The British want their cake and eating it. They want to still be able to play golf on the same course as the rest of us at the times they want.
Why can't I play golf?
Yeah,
play golf.
Exactly. So,
it's no big deal. Just come and go, please. Yes.
And the owners of the course have to have rules in place to the benefit of all the remaining owners, or remaining members. So, I think this is why the British position, intellectually, they're intellectualizing it themselves, that they want to have the freedom to do other things. But you can't actually have access to the European single market on your own terms. You have to do it on the terms of the other 27 remaining states in it.
You went to North Korea with Dennis Rodman.
Yeah.
You made a documentary.
Yes.
Tell us a bit
Dennis
about
Rodman's Big Bang in Pyongyang. Yeah, that was my journalistic midlife crisis. That was...
So tell us a bit about North Korea. What was that like? You got good access?
Reasonable access. We were pretty tightly controlled. I remember on one of the days, for example, one of the American basketball players tried to take a walk out of the hotel, and suddenly there are sirens screaming, there's police cars arriving. His minders, who he had slipped, ran off and grabbed him back. It was that type of place. It was, you did not do anything outside of the pretty tightly conscripted roles that you had for us. So we got to tour Pyongyang. We did a couple of tours. But
did you meet the man himself?
I wasn't allowed to meet him. I was in the room with him, shall we say, but I wasn't allowed to actually approach him or talk to him.
But of course, he's divinely instituted by God, so essentially he would be everywhere anyway. So man.
Well, actually, the day of the actual basketball game, which Rodman had organised to honour Kim Jong-un's birthday, when he entered the hall, the closest thing I can actually compare it to was being in Ballybrit for the Pope arriving for Mass in 1979. The young people of Ireland, I love you, because the reaction of all of the people there. Now, I suspect that they were on sort of under such instructions. They feared that if they didn't clap wildly like seals, that they would be in danger of being killed.
Well, you see his military elite around him there. Whenever he says anything, whenever
they all write down. But I want to say they're writing. Actually, they actually all have notebooks. The military elite all go around with notebooks, and they write down everything he says, like words of wisdom to live by, or else instructions that they actually have to follow. But I had a minder for the entire trip that I was there, who only sort of left me when I got to my hotel floor. And she actually was so excited after the match, and she used to call me Mr. Matt. And she went, Mr. Matt, thank you so much for coming to North Korea. And I went, well, thank you, why? And she goes, if you hadn't come to North Korea, I would not have been in the same room as our dear leader. And this was, as far as she was, filled with joy. I mean, this is a cult. This is a national cult.
Oh, it is. Is it? This isn't not just a kind of a Western sort of media image of the place. It is actually, the people actually consider this man to be...
Absolutely. And I mean, I can genuinely say, I mean, she was genuinely overjoyed that she had been actually at this basketball game, but not that she was at the basketball game. She didn't really care too much about that, but she was in the room along with 7,000 other people at the basketball arena with thing, and we were actually sitting quite close to him. So the fact that she could just keep looking over, my God, there's my dear leader. It was actually quite extraordinary to watch this in action. But there was actually another, just to show you, you can get paranoid in relation to these things, but one of my colleagues, I have a production company in Kieran O'Hara, my fellow director, was with me on the trip as well, and he went to his hotel room and he opened the windows in his hotel room, and he then got a phone call. Please, sir, close the windows in your room.
Okay.
And he's okay. And he's trying to wonder, are the cameras in here in the room, looking around. We actually worked out, we actually think we were being observed from the hotel directly across, that they actually were watching us to what we were actually doing and whatever.
Can I ask you, how did you come to be there? What was, there was a basketball match, wasn't there?
Originally, the North Koreans agreed to this on the basis they thought there would be positive publicity and everything for them in it.
Okay.
Then, of course, they got very, very wary about what we were filming and what sort of story. And the story actually became as much Dennis Rodman went on the drink because the stress got to him over there. So he actually got very, very drunk and was particularly drunk during the game. He also sang Happy Birthday to Kim Jong-un in the basketball arena in a fashion I think was probably the like Marilyn Monroe singing to John F. Kennedy. It was embarrassing to the extreme. The American players were appalled at what was going on. Some of them wanted to go. In fact, at one stage before the game, some of them decided to go on strike. They wanted out, and we had to call a couple of them across and say, how are you going to get to the airport? What do you mean, how are we going to? I said, you can't call a taxi. You don't have a car, you're not able to get to the airport. Oh, just say somehow you managed to get to the airport, you don't have your passports. Remember, they've kept all our passports, and that's what they did. When we arrived, we handed in our passports, expecting them to be checked and handed back to us. We didn't get them till we were leaving the country again. I said, so what flight do you expect to be able to get on? What passport do you have to get out? And he sort of looked at me and went, oh. I said, I think you're playing the basketball game. If we're all going to get out of here, you play the game. That we actually had to play along with an awful lot of things if we were going to get out. That we were guests of the nation. We had put ourselves in a situation where we actually had to behave ourselves. So we had actually almost willfully imprisoned ourselves. And the realization struck a number of hours into the visit and started thinking, should really work that out before I actually came here.
And you were nearly detained, weren't you?
Yeah, there was an incident. Rodman got into a row with me at the official state dinner where he suddenly took against me, and he got up and he started roaring at me. He started roaring at me that you're not writing a book, because part of my reason for being there is that I was going to write the story of it and stuff. Okay. And he actually then, in front of all the North Koreans, started screaming, you're not writing a book. And then a number of the North Korean officials at my table, through an interpreter, started interrogating me as to what was my real reason for being there and all the rest of it. And I said, I'm here to cover the match. And I had gone in as a sports journalist, and that was my thing. So obviously they would have done their background checks and all the rest of it, and they would have known that I had more interests beyond sports journalism. But I had to persuade them that I wasn't there to write a book negative about North Korea. And it was actually the scariest night of my life, because I was afraid that they were going to detain me and keep me away from the rest of the trip, and then would they let me go back with the rest of the team? And the
detainment there would have meant a long holiday.
Yeah, no, we had an insurance policy in place effectively, in that I'd left back in Dublin letters from the North Korean Olympic Committee asking me as their guest to attend the trip. And our reckoning was the Sochi Winter Olympics were on about 4 or 5 weeks later, which North Korea was going to. So the idea was that if I or anyone else was detained, that these letters back here in Ireland would be produced and said, hold on a second, for the Olympic Council, saying the North Koreans brought these people in good faith as guests. How can you bring them, the Olympic Committee, accommodate them at Sochi? That was our thinking. And that may have actually worked, because despite the fact that they had misgivings about me and a couple of the others being there, they left us continue to go to events and whatever. One of the guys said to me, he was one of our other minders, and he was spending more time with Kieran than he did with me, but he said, I've been with this before, and he said, you know John Sweeney, the BBC journalist? And I said, yes, actually I do. And John Sweeney had done a programme. He had gone in secretly into North Korea with a group of students, and they had filmed secretly and come out. And this individual said, my friend was John Sweeney's guide, and he suffered because of that particular piece. And I said, suffered? And he sort of looked at me and he went, yeah, he was demoted. And afterwards we wondered, demoted in what way? He was actually quite upset when he heard that. I told him on the phone about this, because he was worried about the people that may have been put in harm's way by the documentary that they made. But that's the level you're working at. This is not something this is not some sort of happy camp, no matter what Donald Trump is now trying to portray it as being. And his great mate and great friend Kim Jong-un, who of course has continued firing missiles off ever since.
Where does that come from, by the way? That relationship between Trump? Does he just likes him? Why? Because because they're similar people?
Because it makes for television. Look at all the television coverage they've got out of it. That seems to be all Trump lives for. He gets them on television.
You've got one fun fact, which I think everybody should know, anybody who's planning a divorce, about the American basketball players who played in this match. Tell us a little bit about their capacity to lose money.
It was an incredible group of players. This is over 5 years ago, so I'm struggling to remember all of them. But there was one guy particularly, Vin Baker, who was a member of the 1992 American team that had won the basketball Olympic gold medal at the Barcelona Olympic Games. And Vin had lost over $200 million of his fortune. At that stage, he was a preacher, but the last I heard of Vin, he was a barista in a Starbucks in Philadelphia. That's where he'd actually had come to from having been this basketball superstar. And the agent who had helped assemble the team for Rodman, I think they were all paid something like $10,000 each to go to North Korea for the 4 days. And this is what they needed, the cash to bring in. He estimated the collective net loss of the team of wealth at over $500 million. $500 million all down to alcohol, gambling, divorces. And as the old joke goes, they wasted the rest of it.